Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
On the last 4 weeks of our 12-week series on confronting hate, humanity's greatest challenge, we're changing formats to some extent. We're taking excerpts from keynote speakers during our conference on confronting hate and airing them on this program. Therefore, we will not be having our panel and we will not be asking questions, but as I've indicated, we're going to take excerpts from 3 keynote speakers and also on one of the programs from 3 panelists during that week's presentation. I want you to understand, however, that of course by taking excerpts you do not get the entire speech, but we attempted to take those sections that we thought were the highlights of those addresses. So we hope that you will enjoy those keynote addresses as you have our interviews over the past 8 weeks with some of our guests during Confronting Hate. On this first program of the 4 dealing with keynote speakers, we are very pleased to introduce to you Father Robert Spitzer, who is the president of Gonzaga University. He was the opening keynote speaker at our symposium in the recent past. He has also been very supportive of the Gonzaga University Institute for Action Against Hate, and is a very appropriate speaker for this first program. And that institute, in our understanding, is the only one in the United States at any college or university that is addressing hate. Therefore, it is a great pleasure on the part of the North Idaho College Public Forum to introduce to you for his keynote address or excerpts from it, Father Robert Spitzer, the president of Gonzaga University.
For those of you who are here for your first Popcorn Forum, you're about to experience an unparalleled slate of keynote speakers and workshops. We are drawing on the best and brightest educators and community leaders in the Northwest. Their commitment to confronting hate both globally and locally has been a source of daily inspiration to me, and I hope it will be to you as well. You're about to meet such luminaries as Father Robert Spitzer, who is here, president of Gonzaga University, as here as our keynote speaker today. It's my privilege to have you here, sir. You honor NIC by your presence. You'll also hear from faculty and staff from Gonzaga University, Whitworth College, the University of Idaho, Eastern Washington University, Washington State University, North Idaho College, the community colleges of Spokane, and Lewis Clark State College. You will have the opportunity to learn from key members of groups active in the fight against hate, groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, and you will hear from a Holocaust survivor. This year, we are fortunate to be joined by many, many extraordinary partners in this Popcorn Forum: the Kootenai County Task Force for Human Relations, the Human Rights Education Foundation, Gonzaga University's Institute for Action Against Hate, KSPS, and Harvard University have all joined arms with us to make this event possible.
I want to say, first of all, what an honor it is for me to be here and to be in the midst of a forum that has such a tradition of doing not only social justice, but the common good in so many different ways, through so many different disciplines, through so many different universities, that benefits not only our local community, but obviously whose discussions are going to benefit the nation as a whole. I'm very honored to be here today to present this keynote, and also honored to be in the midst of all of you who have tried in so many different ways to make our nation and even the call of justice and the call of peace, and what I would term through my own faith, the call of love, to be a reality in our culture, in our community, in our society, and in our country. Thank you so very much. What I thought I would address today is one particular angle on hate. It is a difficult topic to consider straight on for the obvious reason that it is, of course, intrinsically negative. So I thought I'd do this angle on hate from kind of a threefold perspective. The first thing I wanted to do was see it in the context of its opposite, namely love. Because I think to try and look at hate, which is an intrinsic negative, straight on, almost, has no content, if I could use the words of Plato. In other words, when we try to look at something which is essentially a negation or a privation, straight on, without reference to what it is negating, it almost is like looking at a vacuum, something empty. But if one can see it in relationship to what it's negating, then the seriousness of the issue with which this conference is dealing becomes rapidly apparent. The second thing I wanted to do was to look at it from the vantage point of redressing it. We can get, as it were, overwhelmed by hate. We can be consumed with looking at it, almost as if we were consumed at looking at a macabre figure that suddenly comes into a hospital room, and we're fascinated, gazing almost upon the macabre, instead of, in a sense, looking at what can we do not to be fascinated by what is so negative, but instead to be working to redress with the positive, with the sense of love, what is so negative. I don't have to tell you this. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, obviously. But what I want to say is all of your efforts, already so very much involved in redressing this issue of hate, maybe perhaps as a philosopher, which is my discipline, maybe as a philosopher I can add an angle, add an insight, add a moment, add something to the way that we might be able to redress it from my particular discipline. The third thing I wanted to do was to take a look. I think hate is a progressive thing. I agree with most thinkers that hate begins in the human heart for various reasons, which I'd like to discuss. But then I think it quickly moves from the personal and it becomes interpersonal. Indeed, today I'm going to begin with the interpersonal dimension of hate, because I think hate is essentially an interpersonal crime or an interpersonal sin, if I might use a theological term. There's something interpersonally undermining of what is intrinsically positive between human beings. So there's an interpersonal dimension to hate. But hate doesn't stop there. It kind of gets to a communal dimension. There's something in which, in a way in which groups start appropriating a negative interpersonal dynamic, and then when the group or the community or the communal group starts appropriating this negative interpersonal dynamic, they can enhance it. They can fill it with fear and fill it with blame and fill it with all kinds of, as it were, negative energies that were not there with the mere expression of it interpersonally. And finally, then, hate can even take on a further dimension. I mean, I do think it can be combated and it can be stopped at its roots, but we must look at it for what it is. And it can even take on a societal dimension. I don't have to tell you here. Many of you are historians and sociologists who know much more about this phenomenon than I do from the vantage point of your disciplines. But the key thought is that when hate takes on its societal dimension, it brings with it two other things: cultural sanction and even historical sanction for hate. And when cultural and historical sanctions are added to the group dynamics of hate, then of course it becomes almost intransigent and much, much more difficult to resist and to stop. And therein lies the problem. In order to stop it, we are almost forced to resort to means of resistance which seem like hate itself. Almost to go to the extremes sometimes of violence to stop what seems to have a cultural and historical sanction in order to redress that form of hatred. I guess the theme that I would then want to promote as a philosopher today is, as I move into this theme of hate, is it is always easier to stop hate at the personal level before it becomes interpersonal. It is easier to stop hatred at the interpersonal level before it reaches the communal level, and then therefore takes advantage, as it were, of that community sanction or that group sanction. And it is easier to stop hate at the communal level before it takes on the level of cultural and historical sanctions, and then becomes so difficult to reverse. We always have a choice about how we're going to look at another human being, and I'm speaking interpersonally here, not societally or communally yet, but just interpersonally. When we confront another human being, we always have a fundamental choice. Good news or bad news? What am I going to be looking for the minute I encounter this other mysterious human subject? And then, secondly, whether I'm looking for the bad news or the good news, I generally make a decision about whether I will look at the person as problem or to look at the person as mystery. So the first thought then about love is, we probably have to make, from the very get-go, we're going to have to make a decision about how we look at the human other. Good news and mystery, we may proceed to love. Bad news and problem, we will probably proceed to hatred. But that moves us to a second stage. The second stage in the moment of love is empathy. You know, that connection with the other. Empathy, that marvelous way in which human beings are constituted. Empathy that enables us to form a connection with the other, whereby doing the good for the other is just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for ourselves. Empathy that literally breaks down the enmity between human beings. Empathy, the powerful tool of connecting with a person so unqualifiedly that I can actually see the intrinsic dignity of the human other so clearly that I can actually respond to the unique goodness and the unique mystery and the unique transcendentality of the other so clearly that doing the good for the other is just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for myself. What I would like to suggest is, if I begin with looking for the good news in the other, if I begin with looking at the other as intrinsic mystery, then empathy so naturally follows. Human beings have a goodness through which empathy so easily follows. But if we begin by looking for the bad news in the other, if we begin by looking, as it were, for the problem that is the other, if our fundamental attitude to the other as we confront the other is one of separation, then the opposite of empathy happens, namely antipathy. At this point, then, instead of a connection with the other, the dynamic that begins to occur and roll out as I focus on the bad news and interpret the bad news as badly as I can and see others as problems, what begins to happen are three things which stand at the root of hate. The first thing is, and inevitably so, I fear the other. How long can we look at the bad news in the other before we become obsessed by suspicion, involved in a hermeneutic of suspicion? Perhaps you say the suspicion is warranted. Well, if that is the case, then bracket that for a moment and simply look at what begins to occur when, in looking for the bad news, we begin, and I have done this so often, we begin to obsess with unwarranted suspicion. And that unwarranted suspicion then leads to a level of fear, which of course becomes in itself obsessive, which means that I have to become defensive and even move to a second aspect, that is involved with hatred. It's a second aspect of antipathy. It's a second natural outflow of what happens when I'm looking for the bad news in the other. And that is, of course, that the other becomes disturbing to me. I not only fear the other, but now I find the other to be a disturbance. Instead of seeing the intrinsic goodness in the other, I begin now to see the intrinsic evil of the other. All too willing, I have done this so often, to attribute a motive of evil to a person who is actually operating out of a motive of goodness or justice. All too willing to attribute a motive of evil to a person rather than merely an action. All too willing to take a mistake of another human being and to try and whitewash their entire personality with a sense of just the evil of the person themselves. What begins to happen then, as we move out of this fear to this deeper disturbance, is of course the ultimate in disrespect. We brand the other person as evil. When I have engaged in this, I have not engaged in it in some kind of cruel way. I found myself sucked into it by my fears, sucked into it by my disturbance at somebody's mere disagreement with what I've said, at my disturbance or my irritation with some manner that I found intrinsic to the bad news which I was looking for in the other. And when that began to happen, when this fundamental disturbance began to happen, when this sort of step-by-step disturbance began to happen, when I was all too willing to unjustifiably see the evil, not just in another's actions or in another's mistakes, but to see the evil in them, when I was all too willing in a moment of utter self-righteous contempt to brand the other as evil, I moved to the third stage of antipathy. And the third stage of antipathy is, it's kind of interesting. Once disturbed in my soul, once almost reaching that moment of self-righteous contemptuousness whereby I've branded the other as evil, I am now in a mode of being, as it were, unforgiving. I am now in a mode of wishing destruction upon the evil. I am now in a mode, instead of wanting to do the good for the other, because doing the good for the other is just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for myself. I am now in a position of wanting to do the bad to the other in order to annihilate the evil which most certainly confronts us. And in that moment, filled with contempt, filled with pride, in that moment, I wish for the disunity and even the destruction of another human being. The third stage is to want to go out, get this, and share my vision of antipathy with others. Hatred has a bizarre consequence. And it's literally the same dynamic of love in the sense that it moves outside of itself. Of course, hatred does it negatively, love does it positively. But the key thought is there's almost this interior dynamic to want to move outside of itself. So that antipathy, like empathy, right? When I empathize with another human being, when I see the good news in another human being, when I see the intrinsic goodness of that other human being, when that other human being becomes quite irresistible, and I just want to do the good for them because doing the good for them is just as easy as doing the good for myself, I want to share that vision with everybody, right? I mean, love just has this way of going outside of itself, and when it goes outside of itself, you just want to tell everybody else about the good news of this other who who may be your friend or may be a complete stranger, but you caught the glimpse of the intrinsic, unique goodness and mystery and dignity of that other, maybe just by a tone in their voice, and you want to share that with others. Well, hate has the opposite dynamic, as the opposite in terms of its negativity, but the same kind of dynamic of moving outside of itself. Oddly enough, we want to share and convince others of our antipathy. But the key thought that begins to happen then is that the group looks for a higher sanction. The group based on antipathy looks for a higher sanction. And the only higher sanction it can get is one that is cultural and societal. And so, of course, the group then tries to convince other groups that their hate is one that is really significant and a good way of premising purpose, happiness, meaning, and direction in life upon. Once that occurs, of course, when many groups get together, they form the capacity to create a cultural sanction. And once the cultural sanction occurs, it becomes embedded in history. And once it becomes embedded in history, it forms a momentum which takes the most drastic steps to try and avert, to stop, to reverse, and to redress. But how do we stop it? What are the tools of anti-hate? I mean, where can we begin? Where can we begin in the human heart? I'm just a philosopher. I have to say, there are people here in this audience who understand far more the dynamics of groups and the dynamics of cultures and the dynamics of society than I do. But I do know one thing, that it begins in the human heart, and that there is both a collective call, an individual call, a group call, a cultural call, and a societal call to the four principles that I would like to talk about right now, which I think are the methods of redressing hatred. I'd like to speak, first of all, about moving beyond the centrality of ego for a second, because I do think pride cometh before the fall. That there is something in the midst of pride which is causing us to look for the bad news in the other, and speaking only for myself, speaking only from my own experience, every time I find myself defaulting to looking for the bad news in the other first, to wanting to proceed to the other as problem rather than mystery, and then proceeding to all the steps of antipathy, to fear, and then, of course, to that brandishing of people as evil, to demonization, and then sharing my newfound happiness in quelling the demon. Whenever I do this, I know that pride was always somewhere. Somehow my ego was always somewhere in the midst of that hatred. And the first thing I must do, the first thing I need to do as a human being is to redress that. I'm going to redress these fast. I'm going to talk about these fast. Number two, the second thing that needs to occur is not merely a confrontation with my own ego, our own egos. The second thing that I think is absolutely required is forgiveness. I do believe that forgiveness redresses the problem of vengeance begetting vengeance and violence begetting violence. I do think it undermines the sense of real antipathy. The third thing that I want to talk about is, of course, our natural drive toward empathy, and to use that as an unqualified tool in order to redress the view of antipathy. In other words, there's a natural drive in all of us to catch that glimmer in another human being's eye, to catch that sense of who another human being is. There's something about us that naturally desires to connect with the intrinsic goodness, the unique goodness and mystery of another human being, that if we let it loose, if we somehow allow ourselves to give way to that power, that empathy has a way of taking over, and then I doubt my fears. But there is a fourth thing that we can do. It comes as no surprise, being an educator, what I am going to say. Education also undermines antipathy. See, the reason that this occurs is because, of course, education wants to look at all angles, wants to probe the depths as deeply as it can be, as the depths can be probed, wants to look at the other human being from the vantage point or through the eyes of others, because I really do believe that violence will beget violence, and vengeance will beget vengeance. Even in great ideological struggles that are supposedly for the good of the people. And in the end, at the end of the day, we need to relinquish even the just penalty for a just harm that seems to have been committed. That somehow, at the end of the day, we need to take those elements that we see even in our own human hearts and let them go. Let them go, in a sense, not to say don't protect people in the future, not to say let social marginalization continue, not to say social evil should continue, but to let them go so that as we try to resist social evil, as we try to resist social injustice and marginalization, as we try to embark on this process of resistance for the good of overcoming hatred, that we do not become victims of hatred ourselves. For the act of forgiveness is a conditioning of the human heart away from hatred. And that will make the resistance of social evil or social injustice a pure thing. I by no means practice this perfectly, but these are 4 pledges which I hope together as a community we can embark on for the sake not only of peace and social justice, but for the sake of overcoming the antipathy and the hatred that take the finest aspects of human creativity and ruin them, but instead to replace it by the dynamic of love, which would form a human community where by doing the good for the other is just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for ourselves. Thank you so very much.
I would like to say to our viewers in closing this program that I hope you've enjoyed Father Spitzer's keynote address as much as we have enjoyed bringing it to you on this series on confronting hate, humanity's greatest challenge. Be with us again next week when we will do another excerpt from a keynote address, this one by Dr. Michael Burke, the president of North Idaho College, speaking on the campus of Gonzaga University on the same subject that Father Spitzer addressed at North Idaho College. And I'm sure you too will find this particular address equally significant to you as the one this week that we've had with Father Spitzer. So please be with us again next week at this same time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.